This is The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America with senior economists Mihir Torsekar and Andrew Reschenberg.
When an American drug company launches a new medicine, there's a rising chance the molecule behind it didn't come from an American lab. In 2022, about 5% of the big licensing deals in the pharmaceutical industry, the ones $50 million or more, went to Chinese firms. By the first quarter of last year, it was 42%. For decades, China's job in this business was to manufacture, not to invent. They made generic copies of drugs that American and European companies had already developed, and they supplied the raw ingredients that went into other countries' medicines. The inventing, like the brand new drugs, the first treatment of its kind for a disease, that happened in labs here and in Europe. But that era is over. China isn't following anymore, and in some areas, they're ahead. And the old worry was that China would steal what we invent. And that's still a real concern, but there's a newer one. And that's American drug companies that are now paying Chinese labs billions of dollars for their discoveries. We're effectively funding our own competition. And our guest today helps explain how we got here. Welcome to The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where each week we break down the three biggest stories shaping U.S. trade, industrial policy, and the American economy. I'm Mihir Torsekar. Andrew is out today, so let's get to it. So today we're joined by Caitlin Frazer, the Executive Director of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, a bipartisan commission chaired by Senator Todd Young. They published a comprehensive report and action plan in April of last year. 8 months later in December, Caitlin's team followed with a paper on U.S.-China competition in biotech that puts numbers on the issue. How much American money is going to Chinese labs and what it's buying. Caitlin, thank you for joining us on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning real quick. If you could just talk us through a little bit about the commission itself, why Congress convened it, and what it was actually set up to do.
Of course. So Congress actually created this commission in law about 4 years ago now. And they did so in anticipation of the need to legislate at the intersection of biotechnology, national security, and economic prosperity. And Congress has a practice of doing this from time to time. We're actually the third in a series of emerging technology-focused groups like ours. The first project was cybersecurity, then AI, now biotech. And I think Congress does this in recognition of the need to reach for a deep bench of experts to help advise them on a bipartisan basis about what to do about a complicated technological and geopolitical problem set. Our chairman, as you said, is Senator Todd Young. Our vice chair is Dr. Michelle Rozo, who has a long career in and out of government, including at the National Security Council. And then my 9 other bosses, our commissioners, are a cross-section of folks who represent leaders in academia, industry, former government officials, and much more. And again, I just really want to emphasize that this is a group that was appointed on a bipartisan basis. So for about 1.5 years, our job was to meet with thousands of stakeholders, both here in the United States and globally, to understand the policy issues at play for modern biotechnology and its applications for national security and its resonance for national security. As you said, we published our action plan for Congress in April of last year. And I'm happy to talk about the findings, but what it really boiled down to was that the United States has had a historic lead in modern biotechnology. I keep saying modern because biotech is actually millennia old, but modern biotechnology is really, in many ways, an American invention. But it has not been because of a dedicated U.S. government strategy to secure and advance that lead. It has been because of the strength of our capital markets, the strength of our research institutions, our human capital and our talent programs, and just our innovative and entrepreneurial spirit. Those are the things that have led or have translated to American leadership in biotech. By contrast, the Chinese government, the CCP, has had a strategy for the last 20 years to dominate emerging biotechnology. And some of the dynamics that you described in your opener are the results of that strategy. So our project was about an answer to that dynamic. How do we retain and in some cases regain that historic leadership edge that the United States has enjoyed in this critical technology field?
Yeah, that's great. And I think, keeping in the spirit of the big three of the show, we've got kind of three broad topics that we're going to break the show down into. So starting up front, talking about why this is a national security issue. And I want to start broad here because when listeners think of biotech, they think about it as a health story, like drug prices or new cancer treatments. If you could make the case for why this is a national security issue, we can start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think most Americans' appreciation for biotechnology as mostly a healthcare medical technology that runs in their medicine cabinet, that's kind of where I started. My background is as a congressional staffer, State Department, early in my career. And so I kind of brought the national security lens to this. And I did not appreciate the breadth of impact that emerging biotechnology has across economic sectors and for our national security. So I was in exactly the same headspace when I started this project about 3.5 years ago. But biotechnology is much bigger than medicines. Farmers and growers use biotechnology in our agriculture sector already, and that's poised to grow with some new advancements in biotechnology products. We can use biotechnology to make fuel, to make chemicals, to make polymers and plastics, to make materials. We can actually even use it to extract critical minerals. We can use it for waste remediation, for environmental cleanup. And what that means, actually, I think the statistic that stands out to me is from a McKinsey study that's several years old now. So probably this number is even higher. But they said in 2021, I believe, that 60% of the inputs to our supply chains, the things we make and use every single day, can be made with biology. And that wasn't some science fiction, maybe
Right.
50 years from now kind of assessment. It was a look at, I think, about 300 case studies where we already know that the science is possible. And that translates to 60% of the inputs to our supply chain. So then we can think about it from a supply chain resilience perspective, basically the ability to make things that we need across economic sectors. We can also think about it in more of a narrow defense, traditional sort of national security and defense context. And what we're actually seeing is that the Department of War, Department of Defense, is embracing biotechnology increasingly as a general purpose technology that advances conventional military capabilities. So you can think about military medicine, trauma care, you can think about military logistics, and even surveillance and reconnaissance, and kind of fusing that biological information into the way that we understand the battle space. And for me, all of that translates to, yes, of course, the leading edge of biotechnology has traditionally been in the pharmaceutical sector. But where that goes in terms of American leadership, all of this other potential follows.
Yeah, and I think you really made a really great case as to why this is such a strategic industry and not just like a health industry. And I think strategic industries, one thing we know about China and their strategy is that they've been like deliberate about, over the past 20 plus years, taking what started small, but eventually became dominant positions in steel and solar, rare earth, semiconductors. And this just seems another, part of that playbook, the biotech space. And so a little over a year, I think, before your April 2025 report, the commission, it seemed still believed that the U.S. was ahead of China in this sector. And the April report concluded that we're falling behind in a couple of key areas. So what changed that assessment, and where specifically do you think that we're behind?
Sure. I think it really boils down to that dynamic that you were talking about, of one where, we have understood China's role in the biotech space as one of fast follow. The ability to very quickly scale up and manufacture innovations that were generated somewhere else, either here in the United States or, in Europe or elsewhere. And, historically, we've understood that strength. Like, I think lawmakers, policymakers have been examining, for example, our deep reliances on Chinese manufacturing and on China for the far upstream chemicals that go into our small molecule drugs. These are called active pharmaceutical ingredients or key starting materials, APIs, KSMs. We've understood that dynamic for the better part of a decade. But what has changed in the last year or so, and I think even since we made our action plan public last April, is that innovation race. So not the manufacturing and scale-up race, but the ability to generate new intellectual property, new ideas, new drug discovery, new material discovery. That is the dynamic that we assess is starting to change. And frankly, it's changing, I think, more rapidly than many people expected.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about reading the report that the commission has put together is that, to be fair, look, I worked in government for like 12 years, and I can tell you that we weren't known for producing a lot of, like, the reports that we produce weren't known for their readability. But I would say for the reports I've seen from you all, it's been very accessible, very easy to understand. And one of the things I'll point out is in the April report, you mentioned this kind of alliterative beat that I thought was really elegant. So first they steal, then they scale, then they strangle. And so just to jump to that third beat, that strangle version, what does that look like in biotech? I'm just curious about that one.
Sure. Thank you for the compliment. We worked really hard to make sure that folks of really all backgrounds could engage with our material, right? We knew that there would be national security folks reading it, deep scientific experts, folks with, more agriculture and medical experience. And so we really saw part of our goal as like expanding the aperture of bioliteracy, which we can talk about later if you want. It's something I'm really excited about. But at the end of the day, my calibration was like, would I have understood this a couple of years ago, when I was a legislative director on the Hill? But let's get to the steal, strangle, scale dynamic that you described, or excuse me, steal, scale, strangle dynamic that you described. You asked about strangle and what does that mean in practice? And what we're really describing there is a future where the Chinese government has developed sort of a key choke point, if you will, or area of we've developed a dependency on China for a certain part of the biotechnology ecosystem, or maybe multiple parts. And in doing so, have created for the Chinese government geopolitical or trade leverage. So in the beginning of our report, we actually write about a scenario in which a no-kidding cure for cancer, not a treatment for cancer, but a cure for cancer is developed in China. And over time, American cancer patients gain access to that medicine. But then in the context of a kinetic conflict, the Chinese government chooses to turn off or slow or taper supply to that medicine to create essentially leverage. And that's not a thing that's happening now. Let's be honest about that. But we have seen the Chinese government do something similar in other sectors, to include critical minerals. So I think with that, and we have this huge policy response from the United States government and from the investment community in the United States when China began to control the export of certain types of critical minerals that we needed for not just our defense industrial base, but our electronics and IT sector. So that's the type of action that we think could happen if we, sort of develop and deepen these dependencies on China, not just for manufacturing, but frankly for our innovation base as well.
Yeah, it's not, you're right, it's not an abstract concern because we've seen this strategy play out in real time. I mean, once they, gallium, germanium, I mean, you could go down the list of the periodic table practically that China has a stranglehold on, the rare earths and all of the critical minerals, and they have in some measure, weaponized it a little bit, used that as leverage, and it's really awakened people to the concerns here, the choke points, as you mentioned. And you mentioned also upstream, like the active pharmaceutical ingredients we've talked about at CPA. A lot of the work we've done is looked at just how concentrated that is in China as well as India. But, one of the things that when we talk about China, it's often, you're not going to get too many skeptics when it comes to the whole idea of like, oh, they're just stealing or they're just subsidizing and that's the key to their advantage. One of the things that surprised me when I've looked at this issue is just, this isn't really just a story about theft here. I want to get to the second segment here where we talk about how, U.S. companies are actually now helping to finance some of these ventures. There's a record number, for example, of licensing deals in place between U.S. pharmaceutical companies and Chinese biotech firms. Last I checked, it was about $53 billion worth of deals since 2020. And I don't think most people necessarily know what's being bought here. So like these aren't necessarily like finished medicines, but what part of the drug development process, I guess, are these deals buying? If we start there, and if we could talk a little bit about the implications of this whole licensing infrastructure that's being built.
Sure. So generally speaking, these deals are mostly about major American biopharmaceutical companies out licensing intellectual property from Chinese biotech startups. So they've discovered a Chinese biotech startup has discovered a new molecule, a new promising new therapeutic, and rather than develop something similar through domestic R&D channels, companies are doing licensing deals for that intellectual property, which they will then scale up and bring to market, through their traditional channels. And a lot of these deals have these huge price tags on them. $1 billion plus if the medicine is successful in meeting, multiple milestones over the course of its commercialization process. Our concern about these deals is really that money and those investments just get circulated back into R&D and innovation in China, Chinese biotech startups, and not into the innovation pipeline and the R&D pipeline here in the United States.
Yeah, and so it's like is it pretty accurate to say that the early discovery kind of is happening in China? U.S. firms are picking up the expensive late stage trials. Is that dynamic pretty much well captured in that?
It depends. I think it's hard to generalize across all of these deals, but yes, I think safe to say that what most of these deals have in common is that they are out licensing. The Chinese startup is taking care of sort of the early discovery process. They get something promising. Maybe they take it through, first in human trial. Maybe that happens, with the pharmaceutical company. But early stage, and then it gets picked up once it looks promising.
Yeah, so when we think about just the lay of the land here, I mentioned earlier that, a lot of people would be on board with the idea of, China's just, this is all a story about theft. They're stealing our intellectual property and all of that stuff. But if you actually look at how they have prioritized this industry and their approach to, becoming a competitive industry, they've done things like streamline the regulatory process. That's been a real priority for them, and they've made real results in doing that. And now they're approving so many early stage clinical trials. Talk a little bit about that. So those are the things that I feel just don't get enough attention. Like these are legitimate moves that they're doing to kind of streamline regulatory procedures and things like that we could really learn from, I think.
Yeah, I think, the way that we describe it here at the commission is essentially that they use both licit and illicit tactics to gain dominance. So you're right. There's plenty of things that the Chinese government is doing above board to strengthen their innovation ecosystem. One of those things are major regulatory reforms, some of which are designed to bring drugs to market faster for the Chinese people, and others of which are designed to attract clinical trial activity, away from the U.S. or Europe or even Australia, and kind of accelerate that first in human trial, phase 1 trial activity. But it's also on the back, like I said, of 20 years of strategy, which has included illicit tactics. So it's not just the kind of IP theft that I think a lot of American companies have become accustomed to. And certainly at the commission, we heard from plenty of American startups who described a scenario in which they would present at a conference or, pitch to an investor and then see a copycat, company and a copycat slide, pitch deck from their Chinese competitor weeks later. So that activity is still happening. It's still something that companies routinely talk to me and my team about. But we are also starting to see real innovation on the back of major investment that the Chinese government has made, in talent cultivation, in research infrastructure, as well as manufacturing infrastructure. And the use, we talked in our December papers about the use of these government guidance funds to drive capital into the Chinese biotech private sector ecosystem. So it's a combination of things that is going on here. But this is no longer a fast follow dynamic or a Me Too dynamic. This is truly a competition about being out innovated.
So let's step back for a second because it occurs to me that, a lot of the listeners might think to themselves, like, what makes China unique? Because, I mean, if you're a multinational corporation, first of all, the incentives are there to, lower your costs. And, yeah, obviously people want to see cheaper drug prices. And I think it's hard sometimes to help people understand why China is a different animal in all of this. You mentioned the choke points and the risk of possibly weaponizing a molecule or drug that they have a dominant position over. But what are some of the other concerns that you have? I mean, I know, for example, our research has touched on this whole military-civil fusion. Is that kind of something that you share a concern about, or are there other concerns like on that national security front that make China something that we should really be concerned about?
Sure. So, look, biotechnology is extraordinarily powerful. It can cure disease, it can heal, it can nourish, it can build, but it can also be used for harm. And I think that what we are concerned about is a couple of things. First, that supply chain weaponization dynamic that we talked about. We could talk more about that if you like, but that is a very real and present, national security risk for the United States. But we do need to think about the military-civil fusion dynamic. And I know, your listeners are probably more familiar with this dynamic than most, but basically just to say that the Chinese law allows for the government and the military, the PLA, to work quite seamlessly with the private sector. And, one of our great concerns here is really about data. And the data security laws in China that essentially require that if you're doing business in China, you must make your data available to the Chinese government if it asks for it. Right. And that is a significant national security risk, but it is also a significant business risk. So that is another one of the dynamics that we think is, worth highlighting from a national security perspective. I think the other category of concern that, certainly the commission has wrote about, but that is shared, reasonably widely here in Washington is about the sort of ethical and appropriate use of these powerful technological tools. And we wrote about the need for the United States government to have a code of how, a statement of policy about how we were going to use biotechnology ethically and appropriately in a conventional military context. But I think it's safe to say that we also have concerns about, how the Chinese government would ethically and appropriately apply these tools.
Yeah, I mean, so many concerns that you raised, and it's so good to be hearing that and having this discussion. And I'm happy to hear that, obviously you mentioned up front, you guys are a bipartisan organization or a bipartisan commission that was arranged, that
Right.
there is a lot of buy-in in Congress. And so let's move to segment 3, talking about what's moving and what's left undone. Another really interesting thing about the commission's report that you guys have been working on is that, look, I hope I'm not talking out of turn here when I say Congress isn't always known for moving things along. And yet in your case, I think it was like, 48 maybe recommendations. I'm going to get that number wrong. Is it 48 or 46
49.
recommendations?
You're really close.
49.
49.
I was wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
49 recommendations you all listed in your April report. And I think it was 26 provisions, if I'm not mistaken, that have been signed into law. So, what do you think? Okay, so first of all, to talk about the significance of that accomplishment and some of the big highlights of that basket of legislation that's been, codified.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm really proud of that, execution number, and just want to take the opportunity to say that there is an extraordinary group of people here at the commission, not just our commissioners, but our staff, who have been laser focused on making sure that this is not just a report that sits on people's shelves and that someday in a crisis people go, oh, wait, we probably should have done these things. Congress gave us a year and a half after we published our action plan until the end of this year to work alongside them to get as much of this done as possible. And you counted up some of the numbers. The one that I'm really focused on is that between executive branch action and legislative action, 75% of our recommendations are moving forward in some way, shape, or form right now. So it's not everything all the time. Sometimes we get a little bit of a piece of something, not the whole enchilada, but we are super, super proud of this. And I think it comes back to two things. One is Congress asked for this, right? This was something that they knew they were going to need to tackle. And they can have confidence in the bipartisan nature of the recommendations that we came up with. We are a .gov entity financed with appropriations by the Congress. We are federal employees. We have security clearances. I think there is a, and we can go credibly into members' offices and say, we work for you. We did this project for you. And I think that has really helped. The other thing is that there was already, even before the commission started, a really remarkable network of biotechnology leaders across the United States. I think sometimes folks who aren't familiar with this technology think it's a thing that happens in elite labs in Boston, the South Bay, and it is. But it is also a thing that happens in Indiana and Oklahoma and Texas. And I was just out in Colorado. We have a team going to Ohio today. And we basically landed on top of that infrastructure. And then, again, another thing I'm really proud of is that we helped sort of organize and galvanize all of this existing grassroots energy towards advocacy. And we conducted thousands of stakeholder consultations in the course of this project. But more importantly, over the last year, we have taken our message on the road in our Biotech Across America roadshow. Ohio, just this week will be our 24th state. I think at one point we hope to get to all 50, but I don't think that's going to happen. But we're going to keep going. Maybe we get to 30. And really the essence, and we always invite members of Congress and their staffs to come with us. That just happened out in Colorado. I was out there for 2 days. We had 4 congressional staffs with us from 4 different offices, really digging in to what biotechnology, emerging biotechnology looks like on the ground in Denver, Boulder, and all over that metro area. And the result of that is really significant buy-in from members. I think when we are able to say, this is what this looks like in terms of impact on your state or district, that makes a huge difference.
So if I'm for the listeners tracking at home, this is almost like you guys are almost like a unicorn, if I may say so. So you publish readable, accessible information on something that's a very otherwise complex topic that not a whole lot of people know about. You're able to secure action from Congress, who is typically loath to kind of move on certain things. You've gotten some great traction on the Hill. And so how is it that you all aren't just going to be permanent? Why is it that your commission is going to be ending right soon? Or is that...
That's right.
You guys,
yeah, in December. So
wow.
Our statutory authority from Congress was temporary. They said, go do this project for us. Tell us what we need to know. And, we made that commitment. We while there's still going to be plenty to do at the end of this year, we are actually really excited about the opportunity to kind of transition the work that we have been doing into a durable, sustainable kind of network of advocates and leaders in this space. We now have relationships with 400 member offices on the Hill. In the House of Representatives, there is now a bipartisan biotechnology caucus. It didn't exist even, I think it's literally a year old this month. It has 64 members. Those are champions who have raised their hands to be enduring leaders in this space. So yes, it'll be hard to close the doors here, but we needed to be able to look not just our policymakers, but our industry and academic stakeholders in the eye and say, we have a limited window to fix this. We have time to act. We do not have time to wait. And I think one of the ways that we do that is by saying we need to get as much done as we can before December, and then it will be over to those biotechnology champions and those advocates to sustain the work.
I was thinking in January, we had published something at CPA about this biotech licensing, the deals that are underway. And at the time, I think the Biosecure Act had just been, signed around that time. How, I mean, that's
Right.
the signature, kind of legislation that I'm familiar with. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about how, the that bill has been implemented, and maybe success that might lead the way for future, endeavors, future legislation. Like, how's that been working? Because oftentimes what I've observed, at least from legislation that I see, sometimes we have the best intention, we put a law on the books, and there's loopholes that inadvertently emerge that are
Yeah.
exploited. How
Yeah.
do you, yeah, how do you make you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, for those that aren't familiar with biosecurity, it's essentially this is a really reductive way of describing it, but it's essentially a government procurement ban that says that if you want to work with the United States government, receive a contract or a grant, you can't then turn around and work with a Chinese biotechnology company of concern. And we can talk about how we define that, but company of concern is essentially a combination of two things. One, a list that the Department of War promulgates every year called the 1260H list. These are companies that the department understands or assesses have a connection to the Chinese military, the PLA. And the second category is a OMB process that will be stood up over the course of this year to name additional Chinese biotechnology companies of concern. And so the short answer to your question is that this legislation passed in December of last year after several years of, from origination to negotiation to final passage. And it's not yet implemented. So the law gives OMB some time over the course of this year to come up with the regulations that will lead to full implementation of this. I do think that there are plenty of companies that are starting to think about how to dissolve relationships that they might have with companies on that 1260H list or companies that they believe might be listed as biotech companies of concern. But your point is a really well-made one, which is it's one thing to have, good legislative intentions and congressional intent. It's another thing to see something fully implemented in alignment with that intent. And we are kind of in this implementation phase, if you will, for biosecure. So it's too early to say what its net impact will be on the industry.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a general question for you now. If you could just see, like, if Congress could do just one more thing on biotech this year before you guys close your doors, what would you like to see? What would be the big thing?
I can't have 49 things. I want 49 things.
I'm not that
I know it's
generous.
funny. You're the second person today to ask me that question, and it's a nearly impossible one. I'm going to briefly reject the premise, and then I will answer it. So stick with me.
Gotcha.
Here's the thing. We actually have to do all of these things. There is not a silver policy bullet that is going to fundamentally, arrest the slide of American biotechnology leadership and create a durable American leadership future. We have to do things that are hard, that are going to cause friction between the government and industry, between government and academia. We have to be bold and brave, and we have to do things that we probably should have done sooner. And that's going to cost some money. It's going to require some debate. There are, active debates raging right now on the right way to do these things. We feel like we offered a playbook, but then policymakers, it's a playbook, right? It's a set of recommendations. Policymakers need to grapple with that. They need to negotiate it. But we told policymakers a year ago that they had 3 years to act, or we would begin to lose that historic edge in biotechnology in a way from which we would never recover, because this is not a linear race. This is a race of innovation flywheels that are actually accelerating as we speak.
Yeah, I mean,
A year is
that's
off that clock now, right? So 2
yeah.
years. And we've done a lot. And we should give Congress and the executive branch credit for seizing the moment and getting a lot done, but there is still a lot left to do. And to answer your question directly, I would suggest two things. The first is to pass the National Biotechnology Initiative Act, which is a bipartisan, bicameral bill led by our congressional commissioners. And what it really is about is having the national strategy for securing American leadership in this space. It talks about the need to coordinate across the interagency and to really focus on streamlining biotechnology product regulation, which is a thing that we heard time and time again is a key point of friction between the U.S. government and industry. That bill has a lot of support, and that's growing, and so we would love to see members pass that bill this year. I think the other thing is just kind of I mentioned data earlier. We have a suite of legislation pending in both the House and the Senate that is essentially about making biological data a strategic national resource, both in the way that we collect and curate and make it ready for use in AI models, but also how we protect it. So you asked me for one thing. I think I gave you 49 and then 6, but don't make me choose.
Well, it's funny because it reminded me, because you actually did a great job answering that, by the way. But so when I was a kid and I was asked that question, if you got a genie and it granted you like one wish, I'd say I wish for like a million more wishes, But
Sure.
you actually gave me something good and concrete, which I appreciate.
Thank you.
So
I always just wish for like an ice cream sandwich. So,
always can't go wrong. And I was actually, one thing I was thinking about, to kind of tie a bow around this discussion. Whereas, so again, at CPA, we look at a lot of different industries, and sometimes it can be really defeating because you just look at the story seems so consistent all the time. Like the US was the inventor of this technology. And then in a matter of 20, 30, 40 years, we have seen that lead erode, and you look at enough charts and graphs and you start to see this dissonance between where China is and where we are. And you're just like, how do we even begin the process, whether it's mining of rare earths and elements, things like that. This is an industry, though, where we still, if I'm not mistaken, still have an edge. It's not a wide one, it's a narrowing one, but we still have the advantages that, just that make us the world-class, engine of this industry. So I think, and I got to believe that maybe that is motivating for policymakers to realize that there are things that we can do to sustain that lead. So I think a lot of the research you all have done have kind of really made that case that hope is not lost. We
Totally.
still have everything in front of us,
Yeah. No, I really meant what I said. Like, there is time to act.
Yeah.
There just isn't time to wait.
Yeah.
And, I think when we look at the comparison and in the different metrics, there are still places where the United States is the clear leader. There are some places where we are neck and neck, and there are some places where we are starting, our lead is eroding. My message to policymakers is really that, these are things that we can do right now to create the conditions for, a sustained American leadership in this space. All of our recommendations taken together amount to about a $15 billion investment over 5 years. It's going to cost us a lot more money and a lot more political capital to reshore all of these capabilities once we've lost.
Yeah, and it's did you say 15 billion over 4 years? Did I hear that right?
15 billion over 5.
Over 5 years.
All of our recommendations taken together are $3 billion a year.
That's unbelievable. Sorry, I'm just reacting in real time because I talked to a gentleman who wrote the book about Apple in China. And he talked about how Apple invested from 2015 onward about $50 billion a year in China. And then I was thinking about the CHIPS Act, which was a $53 billion investment over 4 years. And I'm astonished to hear that's a pretty tidy. I mean, wow, that sounds very manageable.
Yeah,
Okay,
we think so too. And we worked really hard to ask ourselves, what are the things that the government can do that only the government can do to create the conditions here? And we imagined not a public-private partnership, but actually a private-public partnership, because so much of the leadership in this space has come up from outside of government. And I don't just mean industry. I do mean academia and research institutions, and I mean philanthropy and all of that. But our question to ourselves very consistently was, is this something that the government can do and that the government can uniquely do? And then we put a price tag on that. And we think it's a fairly reasonable sum. It's a lot, it's a lot of money. I would love $15 billion. But I think it's certainly, if you compare it to something like the CHIPS Act or, some of these other, investments, we think this is doable. And that's really our message to the policymakers.
Fantastic. Well, Caitlin Frazer, Executive Director of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, thank you for coming on the show with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
So learn more about our work at prosperousamerica.org, and be sure to find us on YouTube, and you can check us out, the big three, on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us.